Let's talk about finishing up the odds and ends that didn't get rendered in layers 1 through 4. There are some things that it just doesn't make sense or won't fit or overlap too much that you still need to bring over and you want to do a projected render for. So, the lockdown bar is a good example, the outer rails, we got this piece of wood along the top. Those are things that fall within, category of good things to project, but that we don't want to take up an entire 2048 by 4096 texture for, because there's not enough information all over to warrant that kind of texture size. So what we can do is we can control B to just render a really local area. So something like that around the lockdown bar, and make sure that it's visible to the camera and that nothing else is. Okay. And then we want to make sure that instead of rendering region, we also want to crop to render region, so that what we get, I'll show you. So here's our lockdown bar. I'm going to give it a secondary UV map. If I change this one, it's going to mess up the texturing of the metal that I have put in here. So if I do the second one, and instead of our normal project from view, which would give us one down here, we don't have a texture this big, nor do we want one. We're going to project from view bounds. It's going to fill up this space out to the edges. So what we're going to do is we're going to render it, and then we're going to adjust the texture a little bit in Photoshop to make sure it goes out to the edges. That way, we're just being really efficient with space. So there's that. We're going to render it, and then I'll show you how to bring it in. Here's our lockdown bar texture. Here's our lockdown bar texture, and we need to go to trim. This is in Photoshop, and get rid of the transparent pixels, because remember, our UV map goes all the way out to the edges, so we need our texture to do the same thing. Okay, we also don't need it at full resolution. Pick something reasonable. So there we go. So with that texture, this thing is mapped. Export the mesh, go to Visual Pinball, copy any old mesh you want. So we're going to bring in lockdown. Should be able to see the outside edge. There it is. And then we need to bring in the image. Okay, so simple as that. Now we should be able to test the game and see our lockdown bar. Well, depending on how I've got this set up, of course. That's why you always save before you try to run a game. Every single time. And you have to think about depth bias too, because for each layer we've been, layer 4 gets a 4. Lockdown bar, I don't want to give a 5 because it's going to actually sit over the rails when we put the rails in. So rails are going to be 5 and lockdown bar is going to be 6. Yeah, looks good. Looks weird without the rails there, but okay. So same process for the other stuff. Head up here, we're just going to render that part of it. Make sure it's on. Then there are the elements that we have to cheat a little bit for. So for the rails, for example, we're going to duplicate this camera. And then we are going to keep the same perspective, but we have to go in and change our sensor until we're far enough out that we can actually capture all of the rails. And then finally, as far as projection rendering goes, the last thing you can do is just straight up cheating. So in this case, we're going to take this camera. We are going to lock camera to view so that as we move around, that's where the camera is going to be. And we are going to slide this into a position where we can see the back box. A little bit on the top. Most of the black under here. And we can turn those on for rendering. And so that is just a straight up cheat, but same kind of thing. Do this, and then we'll project from view bounds to bring that in. Some things you just have to do that, and you can't get a good enough perspective. Fast forward a bit here. We rendered out the back box and put the mesh into Visual Pinball. So now all those extra things, with the exception of the items around the spinner, that's going to be a whole separate project. Everything else I think is in the game at this point. So we have to do the spinner, figure out how we're going to do the general illumination lights in Visual Pinball, and then do the drop target shadows. And that should be it. Project should be over. So show you what we accomplished today. It's looking like a fairly finished game. So we'll work on those last details the rest of this week, and then our project should be done.